Yo hoi everybody, my name is Kaga and I am here with another basic introduction to a very integral add-on in World of Warcraft. In this video I'm going to be talking about details. Now details is a DPS meter, but it is way more than that and it has many functions. I'm only going to be talking about some basic stuff to get you started, but details is a very in-depth and very powerful add-on. There are also alternatives like Recount and SCADA, but in recent years I've noticed that Details has kind of become the king of DPS meters, and so I would recommend you use Details. So what it does is, first of all, it just kind of reads the combat log and reads the API for basically everything that happens, right? If I damage these dummies, right, numbers start appearing, and this add-on keeps track of those numbers. Not only does it do that, it also keeps track of literally everything your class does, right? And that is very useful for many things, right? The first is, of course, measuring how much better you are than other people around you, because if you're number one on the list, you are objectively a better person than the number two. But besides that, it is also very good for self-evaluation and for understanding how your class operates. Knowing where your damage sources lie can help you, can inform you on what to prioritize, right? So let's get to the basic stuff, right? So as people damage a target, they will get added to this list. Now you can sort by many things, but the most obvious one is who is doing the most total damage on the current segment of the fight. Right, so if I just start whacking this mob, you'll see that it starts counting the damage I deal, right? And this is just an ever-increasing number. As I do more damage, it will display a higher number. Now, between brackets, you can also track other things. So this 3.6k, for example, is your damage per second, right? Which can also be a useful metric, because total damage is not always the important thing. It can also be important to track how much consistent damage can you pump out. And that's also a way to evaluate your progress. It's usually a better way to evaluate your progress, right? Because total damage can be very circumstantial, and it's also very hard to read out. So knowing how much damage you do over a period of time and seeing that number slowly increase as you become a better player and have better equipment can be very satisfying for some people. And other than that, it's of course also very interesting to see other people that are playing your class doing significantly higher number than you or significantly lower. And in that case, you can start to compare and check their stats. Anyway, I've been whacking this mob for a little bit, and now it's going to, you can click on this, right? You can hover over it. It tells you a little bit of a quick breakdown, but you can also left click on it, and then it brings out the big menu where you can see all kinds of data, right? So in this instance, right, I've just been randomly whacking the mob or the target dummy while talking. So now you see a breakdown of where my damage came from in this random segment of combat. So for example, you see Chaos Strike was my highest. It tells you the total damage and the percentage. And then it tells you every other source. So if I was actually trying to do DPS in this instance, I could conclude that Chaos Strike is by far my most important ability, right? Because it's it's head and shoulders above the rest, right? Melee is automatic, and Demon Blades is a modifier for my melee attack. So these two are completely automatic. So that means that the second, active influence I had was Immolation Aura, and Immolation Aura is doing 8%, and this is doing 16%, right? So Immolation Aura is, in this little segment was half as important as Chaos Strike is. And this kind of information can help inform me that, hey, Chaos Strike is big part of my damage, so I might want to use talents like this one, for example. Chaos Strike has a 10% chance to trigger a second Chaos Strike, right? I might be like, oh, well, Chaos Strike is the biggest part of my damage. I might want to invest in this. So that's a way to self-evaluate. Something that's also capable of doing is, when it doesn't randomly reset because of dots, is it can track buff uptimes, right? So if I start whacking this mob again, I'm just going to go through some random buttons. Just going to press some stuff. Get some damage in there. Get some data for the add-on. All right. So in this little segment, I can then, right? So we have spells again. I can now go to auras, and these are all the buffs and debuffs, right? So those are auras. And it tells me in this little segment that Immolation Aura had a 13-second uptime, and that's 63% of the total time that we spent in combat with this target dummy. It shows me that I have 3 applications, and I didn't refresh it a single time. Well, that makes sense, because I only pressed it once, I think. So I didn't refresh it. So this is very important for not only checking to see if you're doing things right. So you can say like, all right, maybe if I have a second Demon Hunter in the group that I'm very impressed by, I can look at their immolation uptime and can see, oh, well, they have 80%, for example. So they prioritize Immolation Aura a lot more than I am. Maybe I should change my tactics. Or it's maybe 50%. So it's like, oh, so I guess they're doing other stuff instead of casting Immolation Aura, because they don't value it as much as I did on this fight, because I have a higher percentage uptime. But maybe that's wrong, right? Maybe I value it too much. So this is a way to compare yourself to others and to kind of get comprehensive data where you're like, all right, this is the amount that it matters for my rotation. I can also say like, okay, let's say something like, I don't know, Fell Devastation or Metamorphosis has like very low uptime. You can be like, oh, well, it sounded very powerful, but actually it's not very impactful because the uptime is really low, right? So unless that uptime is really important, which in this case it isn't per se, it's like, oh, maybe certain talents aren't worth it because I actually thought they were going to trigger a lot and do a lot for me, but reviewing the data, it's actually not, they actually don't trigger that much as I thought, and the impact might not be as big as I thought, right? So that's something you can glance from auras. Then they also have a comparison tool. Now, I'm not in a party with someone who is the same class and spec as me, but if they were, you would be able to compare yourselves and see, for example, that, right, Annihilation, I casted it 4 times, right, for a total of 8 hits because it hits twice. If I was in a raid, for example, if I was in LFR, or I was doing, a random raid with people I happen to know and they also play the same class as me, it might be really interesting for yourself to look at like, okay, why are they doing so much better than me? And maybe it's just a simple case of, oh, well, they have like 8 annihilations, right? They just have double the spells that I cast, right? So they just, prioritize this spell a lot more than something else, and I was wasting my time casting other abilities while I should have just pressed Chaos Strike, right? Because, Chaos Strike is annihilation in this case. They're the same ability. So that's a really useful tool for self-evaluating and comparing yourself to other people. It's also really useful for shitting on other people and letting them know that they're bad at the game. But you didn't hear that from me, okay? Don't tell Blizzard I said that. So one of the funny things, just to give you an anecdote of how useful this was for me, is that you see Soul Rend right here, dot. Soul Rend is this talent, right? Throw Glaive causes your target to take an additional 120% of the damage dealt as chaos damage over 6 seconds. And you might say like, oh, well, that sounds decently interesting, right? You go to Throw Glaive, it does 930 damage, right? It's nowhere close to Chaos Strike. How good can it be? Well, to my surprise, when I do AoE, Soul Rend actually comes up as the top dog, right? It's the highest source of damage. Even on single target, it does this much damage, right? I would have never known that Soul Rend was this powerful if I didn't have a damage meter breaking it down for me, right? So that's why it's very important to realize, okay, like maybe this talent sounds really powerful and it isn't, right? So you might be like, oh, well, just to throw Sigil of Flame under the bus, right? But let's say like, oh, I thought Sigil of Flame was going to add a lot of value, but I just look at it, it's only 2% of my total damage, right? Who cares? A good version of that is on warriors, right? They have this talent called Sidearm, which gives your auto attacks a chance to throw an axe at 3 opponents. And that sounds really cool because it's just like, oh, I do auto attacks and I just do random damage. Like, oh, that sounds nice. And, then you look after a dungeon, you start looking at, all right, so how much did it actually do this entire dungeon? You're like, oh, it was like 0.8% of my total damage. It's like, wow, okay, that's it's not even a 1% damage increase, So that's how you should start thinking about damage meters. Let's get into some UI for it. So you have these buttons here, and this is basically all your UI for it. The cogwheels, of course, options and stuff. Then we have the list. So this is really important for looking up specific fights, right? So we see target dummy a bunch of times. I think I'm quickly gonna swap over to have a better demonstration, right? So let's go over to my warrior. So I can show you some actual data. I happen to be in the same place, how fortunate. So you can see I did some dungeons on this warrior, right? And now it says, you know, besides there just being other people in the group as well, it also shows you like, okay, these are the bosses you did in recent memory. So I can check like, all right, how was my performance on Surgeon Stitch Flesh, right? I happen to be playing Protection in this one, and it was kind of a boost group, so that's why Chuck is doing massive damage and the rest is not. But I can see like, all right, on Stitch Flesh, you know, this was my damage breakdown. But on Amarth, my damage breakdown is different, and that's because Amarth actually summons a lot of adds, which increases the value of Revenge, right? Whereas Stitch Flesh is a single target fight, which means that Shield Slam becomes a lot more valuable, right? Revenge is still up there, but Shield Slam gains more value. And this is also how you can kind of see, like, alright, how are these fights constructed, and what does that mean for my damage? Right, again, we can see, I guess on this boss fight, I just forgot to press Spear of Bastion. Oh no, it is here. So it hit one time for 17 damage, and on Stitch Flesh, I also did one, but I hit 2 targets, I'm pretty sure. I'm not entirely sure, right? But I could evaluate this if I wanted to know why there was such a huge discrepancy in the damage here. I'm probably because I hit 2 targets now that I'm looking at it, because it is kind of double the damage of this one. So there you go, right? That's a way to kind of evaluate, and you can also see like, you know, Eternal Skirmish. I'm not even sure. Oh, this is my weapon enchant, right? Eternal Skirmish, or my chest enchant. Yeah. So you can see, all right, this enchantment that I bought with money, right, with gold, is adding 1.8% of my damage to this fight. So I can say like, all right, that's money well spent, right? 1.8% is a good increase. I can also see this one, right? Tough as nails. So this is a pretty interesting talent in the protection tree, where basically whenever you block, you deal damage to the attacker, right? That's this one. And it's always kind of hard to evaluate talents like this, right? Because they're basically a math problem, and we, you know, as a player, you don't really have a good conscious brain of like, how many times am I actually getting auto-attacked? You know, nobody keeps track of that stuff. So it is actually kind of interesting on a boss fight to see like, oh, well, you know, I actually got value out of this, even on a single target boss fight with a boss which is mostly a caster, right? If I go to Stitch Flesh, you know, it deals 3.8, right? Deals more damage. So that's stuff you can take into account. And then you can also again check your auras, or you can check your avoidance. I think this is only for tanks because it's only relevant for tanks. Just to see like, all right, how do you mitigate damage and how do you heal, right? Self-healing per second, stuff like that. And then I can see like, all right, what is the value of some other stuff, right? So for example, how many times did War Machine trigger? Did I cast enough Avatar? You know, did I apply Rent, right? I can see I have 92%, so there was a little bit of a gap where I probably should have had Rent up and I missed it, right? So that's a point where, you know, I missed some damage. So alright, some more UI stuff. So we had this one where you can check all the different segments, and then you have the current segment, which is the fight you're doing right now, and then the overall segment, right? And it tells you the overall segment. This is basically the entire dungeon, right? So this is my performance over the entire dungeon. And again, Revenge comes out heavily on top. And it tells you here in the overall, it starts at 0 and 30 seconds with the first trash mob, you know, trash encounter, and then it goes all the way up to Nelthor the Rhymebinder, which is the last boss of Necrotic Wake. You can kind of make this in any way you want. I prefer to have one tab with the accurate data for this segment, and then one tab with the overall data for the entire dungeon so far. You can also see that these numbers are different, and that's how you that's something you can do in Options panel. Now, before we go there, I just want to quickly show that you can also have the report results. You press this icon and then you say report results. You can spam it in any channel you want and lord your superiority over other players. And then you have this button right here, which is reset data, if you want to clear your options, clear your data. So options panels. Now this is very overwhelming because, as I said, details is a mighty add-on. There is a lot of functionality that I don't even know where to begin, right? There's so much to this add-on. I don't even know the half of it. So I'm gonna help you navigate this a little bit with the important factors, starting at bar at the text, right? So you have bar general. You should probably take your time and look through these options yourself if you care about customization. But bar texts, this is an important one that you might definitely want to look at, because here you can select things like, all right, do I want to show total damage, right? So now at the bottom right, you see actually what is total damage, right? You see that Chuck did 1.10 million damage, right? Now, I don't put a lot of stock in total damage, at least not the number, right? I don't need to know the total number of damage. I just need to know that Chuck is doing a lot more than the rest of us. And if it's 1 million or 2 million, doesn't matter to me, right? So I usually disable this one. And what I care about is the show percent or show per second. And the show percent, right? Because percent is basically what I use to determine someone's value. It's like, all right, you're doing 62% of the group's damage. That's pretty good. And then you have things like separators and brackets, right? So brackets is just how do you want to format the data. It's normally total, and then in bracket comes the rest. Since I don't show total, there was no point for the brackets. And then the separator is how you're going to separate between these two numbers, right? I can put these slashes, right? These vertical lines. I can put these slashes, or I can put this little tilde, this squiggly line. It's all up to you, but that's where you can find it. Some other stuff you might be interested in. Let's see, the wallpaper is pretty fun. You can enable it. There's a bunch you can add, right? There's like Blood Death Knights. And you can see you get the wallpaper here. Every class has their own stuff, and I think you can even add your own backgrounds if you want. Not entirely sure how to do that, but I think there was a way to do it. Oh yeah, it might be edit image or yeah, load image. That's how you can do it. But you know, if that's your cup of tea, go ahead. I like it to be as clean as possible, so I don't use a wallpaper. And now you can also see I use a very transparent one. If I go to profiles, you can see the one we used earlier was this one, right? This is what I showed you on the Demon Hunter, right? So you can use it like this, but I tend to like the more transparent version so that it's a little bit less obnoxious. So yeah, profiles, very important. You can save multiple profiles. You can even load different profiles on different characters. Very useful. And then there is all kinds of other options, right? For example, merge trash, stuff like that for bosses on Mythic Plus. There's all kinds of plugins and skins, right? This is all kind of stuff that you can look at in your own time. But yeah, very overwhelming stuff. But those little things like the way you want to present your damage, stuff like text color, text size, this is stuff you mostly want to look at just to see, just to customize it to how you like. And then the bars in general, you can look at, for example, the texture, right, the appearance, how I got these bars like this. That's the stuff you're generally going to look at. Now, lastly, you can check the what kind of data you want, because if you actually right-click, you actually get these options, right? Now, these are not even all the options. You can add more. So I can also look at the healing done, right? A lot of people also like to have damage done open, and then they like to have healing done open. You can also say like, all right, I actually want to track the group interrupts, right? So who is interrupting the most here? And what are they interrupting, right? You can even see here. I can see like, all right, these are the spells they interrupted. I'm not sure, you should probably be able to see the tooltips, but I can't quite see it. But you can, well, I just happen to know this is Drain Fluids, right, from the Corpse Collectors. You can see here the targets. Not sure, it should probably show the tooltip, but perhaps it doesn't. But But that's also really useful, right? If you kind of want to track, like, all right, are people contributing enough interrupts, and does it look good? Oh, it does actually say the tooltip right there, right? The rasping scream, drain fluids, necrotic bolt. It's also really important, like if you're learning a dungeon, it's also really important to check what other people are interrupting, right? Might be really useful when you're in a dungeon and you have no clue what's going on, to maybe check the interrupts post dungeon to see, like, oh, this guy did a ton of interrupts, but he kept interrupting only two abilities, right? Maybe he cared very much about these interrupts, right? You can see Excelsior here was very preoccupied with interrupting the rasping scream, which is of course an AoE fear, right? Very important to realize that that is actually something that needs to be interrupted. So also a very handy tool for learning what needs to be interrupted, if you don't already know. You can add all kinds of stuff, right? There's a lot of options here. CC breaks, right? You can see how often people break your CC. If you want to call someone out, like, hey, what are you doing over there? Very useful. So you can track all kinds of stuff, right? It's very fun to take a look at, see what you want yourself. But I am very happy with my configuration. So other than that, you can. I'm just gonna quickly swap profile before I mess something up. Let's go back to this one. Right, so other than that, you can drag it around. You can make it bigger, you can make it smaller, right? All the basic stuff. You can also add a new one. I even forgot where it is. Oh, here you go, window control, and you can create a new window, right? You can do all kinds of stuff to it. Have 2 or 3 or 4, whatever you want, right? So that's just a very basic introduction to the important, like the few important things about details. I hope you can use this to improve your play and to get a better understanding of how where the damage comes from in your class, and also to be able to compare yourself to potential other players. So good luck on yourself improving, and definitely don't BM other people when they're doing dog shit damage. Right, guys? Have a nice day.